The Phenomenology of the Artist, as featured in Reconstructing A is A, case studies suggesting connections between the truism of the rational and the fate of beauty, and looking to the artist to help envision and grasp the onto-epistemology and metaphysics described in O.G. Rose. Much of O.G. Rose suggests a new metaphysics, a new ontology, and a new epistemology, all of which can seem strange, mystical, and paradoxical. These are fair points of contention, but actually what is proposed in Rose is a lot more tangible and practicable than it might at first seem. We are basically grounding our abstract work in the concrete experience of being an artist, creator, designer, or the like. The creative act is the experience at the center of our thinking, and by examining it closer, a better hold around the ideas of Rose becomes possible. Creatives are at the center of phenomenological experiences which could ground philosophy, I believe. But unfortunately, art and philosophy seem to have been at war for the last 200 years. And philosophy has instead, at least in America, centered on pragmatism. Funny enough, though, in my view, this pragmatism has been captured by what the socioeconomic order defines as practical, and since art is not considered practical, the practices of artists have been excluded from philosophical developments of pragmatism. This is what I strongly resist. I have no problem with pragmatism as long as it takes into account artists. This leads into what I call phenomenological pragmatism, which also resists conflating pragmatism and empiricism, another terrible mistake. I have resisted a phrase like aesthetic pragmatism, for I don't want to slip into a monotheory that treats the experience of the artist as all we need to account for. Rather, I want to include the scientists, engineers, artists, etc. in the same boat, which means I simply want to expand pragmatism to include and integrate with phenomenology in general. That said, the particular phenomenology of the creative act might be uniquely useful in helping us get a grasp around some of the philosophical concepts explored in O.G. Rose. It is to make this case that I have written this short document. I want this piece to be very straightforward, so I'm going to list as a title a main idea, and then under that idea list a practical act of the arts, which can be studied to metaphorically, analogously, and or phenomenologically approach our thinking. Moving forward, whenever I mention lack, for example, readers can consider the experience of Tolstoy writing War and Peace, an idea novel or slash novel that was a present absence. Lack is a strange concept located between being and nothing, but if we imagine that what it's like to write a novel, we can start to get a better hold on how something can be present and absent at the same time. We can also understand how something can be present like a completed novel and yet also not feel like it's totally here. Many writers will talk like their books are failures. By focusing in on the phenomenology of the artist, we can gain imagery and language to better approach the topics of O.G. Rose. Please note that if not everything makes sense just yet, advancing in the work of O.G. Rose will hopefully at least prove easier with these metaphoric and analogous connections to which we can refer. I will not promise to cover all the main subjects that I explore, but hopefully these will provide some examples of why considering the arts might be useful for understanding the ontology, epistemology, and metaphysics I like to explore. Admittedly, based on where this short piece ends up in Reconstructing A is A, there might be a number of terms and constructs readers have not encountered yet. Forgive me for that, but I'm actually hoping that by introducing readers to the metaphoric schemas first, it will be easier to make sense of the concepts when readers encounter them more abstractly, like a hook waiting to hold our hats. For now, if any of the ideas listed below are new or unclear, please just let them wash over you. There will be much more explanation later on in the book. Mainly, my hope is to establish early that thinking aesthetically and considering the phenomenology of the artist is a useful way, if not the best way, to approach and consider the thinking of O.G. Rose. In the experience of writing a novel, painting a painting, and so on, the object we are trying to create is here, and yet at the same time it is not. It is a present absence. And yet the artist organizes and lives their life according to this present absence, unless, that is, the artist slips into despair and starts to believe this work isn't worth doing, or this work will never get done, which they might be right about since they are the contingent element who influences what turns out to be the case. This is to slip into nihilism, while the artist who keeps going can be someone who accepts lack and integrates with it, aware that whatever they ultimately create may not be accepted or, quote-unquote, it, like a person who gets married, aware that he or she will not find complete wholeness in that marriage, and yet still marries. Next construct, A-B ontology, and that's got the A with the slash, A-B ontology. And this would align with paradox, becoming, and so on, other concepts throughout O.G. Rose. To begin, The artist works in a coffee house but also writes. Because the socioeconomic order doesn't tend to support artists, the artists cannot often identify with their job, and they also are in a state of trying to become successful. Yes, successful artists can be their job, but that proves to be a risk. Success can kill the fire of artists. In this way, artists often find themselves having to live a double life, not necessarily because they want to live two different lives, but because they find themselves having to do so to survive. People just don't accept artists, and so artists tend to end up having to be someone they are not, just to get by. Artists are familiar with imagination, as are children, and for a writer to really write their story, they basically have to become it and enter it in a very profound and deep way. Caddy basically becomes a real person to Faulkner, and Hemingway experiences his characters as flesh and blood individuals who he recalls, which is how it feels versus creating. Dancers and actors become their characters in performances. We fail to really capture it if we say dancers and actors only perform, as if there is a division between them as people and them as artists. Similarly, when children play games and pretend to be animals, they really, quote-unquote, are kittens and puppies. They do everything in their power to engage in self-forgetfulness, to use Timothy Keller's amazing language, and yet at the same time, they never stop being themselves. They enter into a space of bothness, and funny enough, it would seem artists and children are just making vivid and bringing to the forefront this truth about all of us, that we are AB and not AA, and yet we tend to accuse artists and children of being impractical and silly. In truth, they are some of the few people who are actually practicing who they are. And isn't it irrational? And isn't it irrational to define pragmatism according to any other standard? Lastly, there is a humility and bravery involved in creativity. It requires us to open ourselves up to something bigger than ourselves, to let the muse have its way with us. And also artists have to often accept the insults and rejections of the society. It is also brave because the artist really might fail, because anything can come out in the creative process, suppressed traumas, painful memories, and so on, and because the artist might really have an idea that he or she then might feel responsible to bring into the world. The risk here is great. Next section. Wholeness, incompleteness, return, so on. And the W is in parentheses, the IN is in parentheses, the RE is in parentheses. And regarding to these phrases, and these are going to be elaborations on AB ontologies and between terms. In O.G. Rose, incomplete, no parentheses, and incomplete, with the IN in parentheses, are not identical, though they sound very similar, which firstly alludes to Derrida's difference and also suggests Hegelian negation sublation. We discuss how completeness is problematic in effacement, but it's also the case that we don't merely want to accept incompleteness with no parentheses, for that would run the risk of nihilism. Rather, we seek to integrate with lack, which is to find completeness in incompleteness per se, which means our goal is something like incompleteness with the I in parentheses, wholeness with the W in parentheses, and the like. Lack itself exists between being and nothing, not being merely one or the other. It might sound strange to live in a state of incompleteness with the I in parentheses, but it can be understood better if we examine the artist. The writer has a book that isn't finished, and yet the writer works on it each day. The writer has to find stability and motivation in this strange already not yet. The book is done in the writer's mind, or at least completable, and yet the book isn't done in the world. The writer has to live with a complete being in his or her head while working to make the being become into the world through his or her pen or keyboard. Furthermore, the writer can complete a book and always wonder what people think about it. I can speak from experience that even when you finish a story, you can find yourself always wondering if you should change something, if it's actually any good or the like. And someone can always come along 3 years later and make you realize there was a story element you overlooked. Relating to old work in art is very strange. And also, as soon as you finish one project, you can feel yourself already toward the next project. Finishing something and having something else to do constantly feel like they are in concert together. We're never completely finished, and yet it's also not the case that we don't ever complete anything. It's both. It's incompleteness, with the I in parentheses. Next category, here-there-ness. As also explored in the absolute choice regarding Hegel and absolute knowing, when we read a book and there is a movie playing in our head, we exist in a strange double place. We are sitting in a chair reading black marks on white paper, and yet at the same time we are also watching Frodo and Sam climb Mount Doom. There is a movie playing in our heads that we see, and yet we don't see it, a bizarre phenomenological experience that suggests precisely why A is inadequate and AB more fitting for human existence. This double place is what I call here-there, and I will describe this experience in the context of memory, imagination, and Hegel, and it suggests how we are able to think according to two different dimensions simultaneously. Likewise, we're able to think of things as being themselves and yet also as not being themselves, which suggests the contradiction of Hegel that Dr. McGowan stresses. Readings suggest that we are not bound by our immediacy, that we are capable of a radical bothness. Next section, language. Artists understand that blue and azure don't mean the same thing, even if they generally refer to a similar tint of color. Words and details matter, and yet artists also know that words have to be played with and destabilized to point to the visions they are trying to craft and articulate. Shakespeare invented many words, and notably poets will search for ways to use language in new ways so that we can see new realities that we might have faced our entire lives without realizing it. Artists realize that languages we learn and use actually impact how we see and understand the world around us. Words impact our eyes. They are not arbitrary. Writers understand words are very strange. They are black marks on white paper, and yet they create movies in our heads. They are images, and yet not merely images. And if a single comma is misplaced in a sentence, the entire effect of the sentence could be thrown off. In this way, artists, especially writers, are deeply familiar with the strange ways that language suggests metaphysics, points beyond itself, while also being itself, and how a sentence has to be just right, perfectly conditioned, to create the right effect. If a word is misspelled, the sentence can fail, but if not, the sentence can strike us just right, as if it was always just right. In this way, language incorporates conditionalism and flip moments, existing in this amazing space where realities are created out of nowhere, but only if all the pieces are in the right place at the right time. A stress of conditionalism, as brought out in Studying in Praise of Shadows by Tanizaki, for example. Zach Highroot Fishman noted the importance of using the same term to communicate a negation sublation, stressing the difference between being a rock climber and being a rock climber, and how a slightly different stress on the term rock climber can completely transform the meaning of the same term. There is problematic wholeness, effacement, wholeness, H-O-L-E, but then there is wholeness with the W in parentheses, which sounds like wholeness, no parentheses, but is no longer an effacement and instead a negation sublation. Mr. Fishman stresses that we need to use the same word, wholeness, to communicate this negation sublation. But if we introduce a new term, that will suggest an entirely new and different intellectual schema versus something Hegelian. In this way, Mr. Fishman suggests how the same language in a different circumstance means something entirely different. Based on the conditions, what emerges and arises can be entirely new. The difference between wholeness and wholeness, W in parentheses, might sound strange, but writers are much more familiar with word plays, the differences between visually seeing a word and audibly hearing one, and the ways in which terms can change their meanings through time. All of this suggests different ways according to which artists approach and think about language, which is to say that words are not merely vessels of information spreading ideas, but entities we experience and that suggest strange metaphysical dimensions that cannot be easily captured in raw materiality. So it goes with paints, the movements of the body in dance, the frequencies of sounds in music. All of these are suddenly what they are not. In this way, the aesthetic experience of language is what we need to incorporate into our thinking and to take seriously. Next category, conditionalism. Between absolutism and relativism, conditionalism is meant to suggest that there are concrete truths and realities which arise when the right conditions are met. To create a shadow and allude to the work of Tanizaki, for example, I must position an object in front of a light source. Does this mean shadows are relative? Not really. It means that shadows cannot come into existence non-contingently, universally, generally, or the like. Their existence is observable and concrete, and yet their existence isn't given relative to any and all circumstances. Please note that if a truth or reality must be universal and or non-contingent in order to be considered true or real, then basically our only choices are absolutism or relativism, the first of which can lead to totalitarianism, while the second can lead to epistemic nihilism. Sure, there is something relative about conditionalism, but it is also far more concrete than what relativism usually suggests, or at least in my view. The writer realizes that if she wants to emotionally motivate her reader, she needs to meet the condition of not having any grammar mistakes in her sentence, of picking the right words and placing them in the right order, of making sure the imagery flows together smoothly, and so on. Like the chef picking ingredients, the painter picking colors, the architect choosing materials, everything has to be just right. If the words in the sentence are beautiful but too sophisticated, the reading experience will be hindered. If the imagery is stunning but distracting from the story, the reader might grow bored. If the characters are interesting but the dialogue between them rigid, the book might end up on a shelf forgotten, and so on. Does the word absolutism or relativism capture the craft of the writer? I don't believe so. And it is by considering the work of the creator that we can better grasp the logic and points of conditionalism. Philosophy often seems more like an art form than a science, even when about science. And if art is best understood through conditionalism, then we should expect the same of philosophy, which would suggest trying to understand philosophy in terms of absolutism and or relativism has been a reductionist mistake, like trying to fit something into a cookie cutter. Please also note that, as argued in Experiencing Thinking by O.G. Rose, just because something isn't a science doesn't mean it is less true than something that is. Science deals with low-order causality, generally involving a single ontology, like physics or chemistry, while the arts can be more focused on high-order causality, involving multiple ontologies, say the interplay between mind and physics. By high and low, I don't mean to establish a hierarchy, for indeed both are necessary and vital at different times. Rather, my point is only to say that while science is perhaps better suited to be associated with absolutism and or relativism, conditionalism is better for philosophy and the arts. The work of Alexander Bard and Alexandra Lung on vector theory would be useful here to consider. Next category, dialogos, participatory knowledge, philosophical practices, and the like. The topic of dialogos, as coined by John Vervaeke, is readily discussed throughout the new emerging online spaces, and it is the idea that there is a kind of conversation where something can emerge which cannot be reduced to the participants, and its birth cannot be readily understood except by those who participate in the dialogos. This thought is overlain with participatory knowledge, which brings to mind Michel Plonier, and generally the idea is that there are things we cannot know or understand except by doing them. If someone were to ask from outside, how does that work? Silence would likely be the response. It is not easy to say how dialogos works, and yet there is indeed a logic to it. It is not random. It is not anything goes. Like the artist, even when we don't know what we are doing, we know once we've done it. Labels, Names, and Poems by O.G. Rose elaborates on this point, but we can think of participatory knowledge as like what is found in a jazz improvisation. Nobody knows what is going to happen ahead of time, and yet there is still a right and wrong way to play. The pianist simply can't play anything, as cannot the saxophonist, and yet it can seem that way from the outside. And when we ask the performers how they knew what to play, and they struggle to offer a convincing a convincing response. Improvisations are not random, but to know what should be played and when, we really must be part of the action. Action we are not part of is inactively watched. And regarding the categories, we can go from there. To conclude, there are other macro concerns of O.G. Rose, such as aesthetic epistemology and the topic of beauty in general, but I don't think I need to make a point to metaphorically connect those with the phenomenology of the artist. Unfortunately, I fear the antagonism which has arisen between philosophers and artists has contributed to philosophers not looking to the arts for metaphors and representative schemas by which new ideas could be mined and explored. As a result, A-B ontologies lacks conditionality. Many useful ideas have been missed and ignored. Looking ahead, the artist knows the strange tension between observing the world and thinking about it, which is a movement between thinking and perceiving, a distinction at the heart of O.G. Rose. Flannery O'Connor stressed the need to stare and really look at things, as did Cezanne, Neshanti, and many others who understood the secret to imagination was really taking in the world, which we all naturally think we do, and yet few of us actually do so with the seriousness required for quality creation. Again, this suggests a distinction to which we will turn to in On Thinking and Perceiving by O.G. Rose. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Substack, Medium, Anchor, Instagram, Twitter, so on and so forth. All likes, follows, shares are appreciated, and thank you so much for your time.